everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold, and you are not. This is a lecture on the King's Indian. There are people in the live audience, and there are also people on the internets. And actually, I think this is the most internet people we've ever had, and it's definitely the most live people we've had since we came back. Now, our lecture is sponsored by a very strong poker player named Olivier Bousquet. I think he's the only person not here. And he's won many millions in poker, and he took some of his poker winnings and decided to sponsor chess lectures. On chess.com, he's about 1,900. So that's not too bad. Yeah. He wanted me to lecture on the King's Indian, and I don't want to tell you how to play like me, so I'm going to give an overview of everything. And in the Chicago Open 15 years ago, I'm guessing how many years ago it was, it was a 7-round tournament, so there wasn't any norms. And in 7 of the games, I had 6 King's Indians. I was white in 3 and I was black in 3, because I play both sides of the King's Indian. Although it's much more likely that I have white than black, because with white, I'm going to have a lot of King's Indians. I play D4 and C4. With black, you have less. Okay, now the first thing to do is to tell you what the King's Indian is. And in this position, we can't say it's a King's Indian yet, because black can still play some kind of Benoni or a Grunfeld. And this is a straight up Grunfeld. And that's not the King's Indian, so I'm not allowed to talk about it. So we'll get rid of that. Crazy. In the King's Indian, it's a very difficult opening to understand, because both sides can play many different ways. So if you have black in the King's Indian and you want to be ready for everything, there's a lot of everything. And if you have white in the King's Indian and you have the lines that you like, you're still going to have to learn a lot of different variations. Now, why does the King's Indian exist? I'm glad you asked that. Many players want to have a very interesting, double-edged, complicated game. The King's Indian is for them. And many of the world's best players and world champions played the King's Indian. And the beginning of modern theory, in my opinion, of the King's Indian is from the famous tournament in Zurich. What year was it, Ovi? Close. Yeah.
1953.
Yeah, somebody just yelled in my ear, 1953. That's right. Yeah, there was a lot of great King's Indian games in that tournament. And that's, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, not a lot of King's Indians, not very popular. 50s and 60s, lots of King's Indians. And of course, Fischer and Kasparov have played King's Indian many times, as well as many other super strong grandmasters. Now, in this position, white will decide at some point, probably now, whether he's going to play G3 and Fianchetto his bishop, just like black is. If he wants to Fianchetto his bishop, usually he plays knight F3 and G3. And this was very popular in which world championship match in the 60s or 50s? Well, wait, 50s and 60s. They played 2 matches. Yeah. Anybody? No. Huh? Close enough. Botvinnik versus Tal. And they had this position often because Tal was playing Benonis and King's Indians, and Botvinnik liked to play the G3 variation. Now, the problem, if you have white in the G3 variation, if you consider it a problem, is that black can decide now to play more of a Grunfeld. Black can decide to play the Benoni. And if black plays D6 and we get a straight up King's Indian, black has a lot of different moves here. So if you have white, you can either know all the moves or just say like, all right, this is enough for me. And black can play knight BD7 and E5. Black can play knight BD7 and A6 and C5. Black can play knight C6. Black can play the burn variation. We play C6, A6, and B5. And then there's knight C6. And then after knight c6, there's different variations, depending on what white does. And also, in this position, I play c6 and bishop f5, although the last time I played that was probably the worst game I've ever lost in my life. It was at Foxwoods 2 years ago, and man, did I get beat. That was embarrassing. Yeah. And the guy was like 150 points lower rated than me, but he knew the line better than I did, with the line that he played. So this is like the beginning of the g3 King's Indian. Obviously, white can castle instead of playing knight c3, and it'll probably transpose. And again, the problem with playing white in this way is you have to know these d5 Grunfelds, since black hasn't played d6 yet. And one thing I can recommend is if you have black in the King's Indian, it's probably a good idea to delay d6. And there's a very famous game that I'm sure you all memorized. It's in my 60 memorable games. It's the famous one where Fischer sacrifices his queen on f4 at the end for a pawn. Okay, that's the only part of the game you should remember. And I think it was Letelier Fischer, but I could be wrong. And in that game, instead of playing the usual d6, Fischer castled, and Letelier tried to punish that by playing e5. And what ended up happening was Fischer attacked the center, by playing d6 and c5 and knight c6, and all the king's horses and all the king's men, et cetera, again. That didn't work out well for white because, black's castled and white hasn't done anything, and d6 and c5 and knight c6 really hit at the center. So e5 is probably premature, and if you don't have to play d6 in this position, it's good to delay it in case you want to play d5 later, or as in my game with Yuri Shulman from the US Championship a few years ago, it was funny. I castled and I played a c6, and what's funny about this is I had prepared a line with c6 and d5, which isn't very theoretical because I'd never played it before, and I thought Yuri Shulman would be like, what's Ben doing? Ben doesn't do this.
Mr. Finegold.
That's me.
I can't hear you, I think.
You can or you can't? What? Can anybody hear me?
Okay, we can hear you now, I think.
Was anybody else having a problem? My internet connection is unstable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was having an issue too, but it's resolved now.
It's okay because people here can hear me and they don't want to hear me. So, yeah, it's the internet connection was unstable, even though I'm hardwired and we have a gig internet. I can see why it's unstable. All right, well, the truth hurts. Thanks, Comcast, or whoever gives us our internet. Thanks. All right, now normally after bishop e2, you get this position, and black, if he wants to, and he does want to, can play knight e4. So Yuri Shulman played an unusual move. He played bishop to d3. That way, if I play d5, I can't play knight e4 anymore because it's defended. And after bishop d3, this was actually quite funny. I decided to play another line with bishop g4, and he played bishop back to e2. So basically, I have this free move in that's probably not where I want my pawn because I want to play knight c6. Anyway, we're out of theory immediately, and it was a very interesting game. We both sacrificed stuff, and I ended up winning, and that's all that matters. Okay, but when I have white, this is how I play with white usually, and most of my opponents play d6. And in this position happens maybe 45 to 50% of the time in King's Indians at the Grandmaster level. So if it's a King's Indian, you'll see this position a lot. It's called the classical variation. White plays e4. Usually black plays d6 first. You can play bishop e2 or knight f3 and then play the other one. And now e5 is the most common move because black doesn't have to worry about white winning a pawn. Lower rated players, usually their knowledge ends here. So, they don't play e5 because they think it's attacked. So they'll play knight bd7 usually. or knight c6. Neither one of those moves is great, but you can do it. After e5, most people castle. Some people play bishop e3. I've done them both. I like to play the exchange variation, which usually is considered drawish. And most people play knight d5 here, but I play bishop g5, which is less common. I've been playing this for 35 years. So when I'm playing 1 minute and 3 minute chess on the internet, I know like forever and ever and ever, my opponents usually are done about here. And I got a winning position against Hikaru a couple of weeks ago, but it was winning until it wasn't. And then I was winning from like moves, I don't know, iPhone entered the waiting room. I like that. Good name. I got to get rid of the chat because it covers up the screen. All right. No chatting. Yeah, and this isn't considered very exciting. Anyone? Somebody?
Why can't you take the pawn on e5 just right away?
Yeah, that's what I was going to get to, but I can't do anything. Okay, so we could take the pawn now or trade queens. I don't know which one you want to do. The problem with taking the pawn is you're lining your knight up with the bishop, so knight takes e4 is a good discovery. So I'd probably trade queens first, but I don't know if it matters. Taking with the knight isn't recommended because it's defending your pawn. I'll take this way, I don't know. Then we got knight takes e4, or we could play rook e8 first. But yeah, this trade of pawns is good for black because white's king is on e1 and black's king is safe. And now we've unleashed the latent potential of the bishop on g7, so now it's actualized potential. Right, Casimir? Yeah, he agrees. Yeah. So a lot of people that are here in person, they don't want me to know who they are because they're going to do secret preparation when they play me next, so they're wearing a mask. Even Karen's wearing a mask, so she doesn't want me to know it's her. Oh, no, she's not. Okay, good. All right. But if you want to take the pawn, I do take the pawn often. I'll show you when I take it. In this position, a lot of people play c6, which is not a good move. And then I take the pawn, and they play rook e8, and I can play f4. Now, because the knight's pinned on f6. And my favorite is when they play rook e8, which is fine. I castle, and then they play c6, and now I take the pawn because the pawn's defended. But I'm like, so what? And this is theory, but usually they don't know it. And the idea is if you take the knight and I check you can't play bishop f8 because your knight's hanging. And if you play rook e8, I take and I defend my rook. So I'm going to be up a pawn. And if you play knight e8, I play f4. And black has some issues. Like, this is attacked, this is attacked, this is attacked. The truth hurts. Yeah. So this is also bad for black. What a lot of people do is they play knight takes e4, which is the usual antidote. And I've had this position many times. Once, before everybody was born, including people who were older than me, I made this blunder, losing immediately. Okay? And the reason it loses is, in this position, rook takes is a blunder because of rook d8, but knight d7 wins, attacking this piece and this piece. The truth hurts. So what you're supposed to do is play knight to d6. And I've had this position on the internet like once a week. Okay, you can't take this. I mean, you can, but this is, that's not good. That's what you call not good. Well, it's good for white. And what a lot of people do who don't know the variation is they try to play bishop takes b2 check because trying is the first step to failure. This actually loses material to a very tricky move. Now, having 35 years experience in this line is helpful because I know all the ins and outs. And especially in 3-minute chess, I get big time advantages, even if I don't get winning positions. Could somebody on the internet or in the live audience, what's the best move for white?
Always play king b1.
Always play king b1 is close, but you're like 1/3 right because the king move. So, what's that? King d2. Yeah, the bishop's attacked. Now you still get credit for king b1 because always play king b1. All right, king d2 defends the bishop because I said so, but it also attacks the rook and the bishop. If you play rook f8 to defend the bishop, then your rook is trapped. Truth hurts. I've had these positions before. Yeah, this is where Lizzo got her inspiration for this song, The Truth Hurts, even though it's Truth Hurts. But, and then if you move the rook vertically, knight takes c8 could win. And if here, I guess everything wins. Bishop f4, bishop f6. Everything should win. Okay, so these are very tricky positions, even though it's supposed to be boring. It's still tricky. So a lot of people want to avoid the exchange variation, so they just don't play e5. And they'll play like knight bd7, and then they'll play e5. I had this position today against Ina Agrest in the Arena Kings. That was actually my last game. And then black sword to passive, and then I got a big advantage, and then I won on time, the usual way that I win, because can't win on the board. Yeah. Okay, now the main line is, in the classical, is this. Knight c6, d5, knight e7. There's many thousands of grandmaster games that start in this position. Now, when I used to give private lessons, one of the positions I gave my students was this one, because they didn't know the position. And I said, there's 4 moves that have been played in grandmaster play here many times. What are they? And nobody, if they don't know the position, nobody ever gets all 4 moves. And a lot of times they'll say 4 moves that have never been played. So you have to sort of understand the position and what you want to do. And that's not easy. Now, when I have white in this position, I almost always play the bayonet attack. Does anybody know what move that is? Close.
B4.
Right. People in my headphones are saying B4. That's right. And what's funny is when the bayonet attack was first played, the main variation was this. There were a lot of games in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in this position. And then later, people decided, I don't like c5, and they started playing g3, which prevents knight here. And the idea is if you play f5, the King's Indian move, then you play knight g5, because you want to hop in here, and you want to take that. And if you want to defend your center, you can play f3 defending your center, put your bishop on e3, play c5, etc. So that became popular. Then Kramnik started playing rook e1. Okay, then that became popular. And after knight f4, he could play bishop f1, because always play bishop f1. And then he would push on the queen side at some point. And sometimes he would even take this and play e5. And there's lots of different ways to play, even just in the bayonet. And you can also play a5 here. That's also very common. And I have a very funny story, which has a very funny ending, but not a good ending, but a funny ending. I was playing in the U.S. Championship many years ago. I'm going to say 16 years ago. And I was playing your favorite player, because you heard of him, Salvius Berchis. Also, you could spell his last name, except for one thing. It's Bercys. Okay, and Salvius isn't easy to spell either. Okay, anyway, I played Berchis in the first round, and Berchis always plays a5. I looked at all of his King's Indian games, always plays a5. So I said, well, if I was him, I would play that against me, because I obviously prepared for a5. And against this, I always play that. So I said, if he plays this move against me to trick me, I'm going to play a move I've never played before. And this is a favorite of Vladimir Apishtin, Queen c2. He made that move up, and I prepared for him once for 4 hours, and I beat him with black in this position. I had a novelty, like I moved 22, and I played it. But anyway, when I played queen c2, he put his heads in his hands for like 10 minutes because he didn't know queen c2. He doesn't play knight h5. He plays a5. So he was like, what? So I tricked him before he could trick me. Thought he tricked me. But anyway, the reason that story has a funny ending is the game was drawn in 153 moves. Rook and knight versus rook. So I had the rook and knight. Yeah. It sounded funny until it happened. Yeah. Okay. Two of the most common moves are knight d2 and knight e1. They have the same idea. When black plays f5, which is a key idea for black in the King's Indian, black wants to play f5. So black's going to move his knight out of the way and then f5. Then he's going to attack on the king side. So if I play knight e1 and you move your knight to d7 or e8, you can't go to h5 now because I'll win a pawn. Okay, and the point of knight e1 is after the knight moves, let's say here, okay? Now, there's two ways I can play. I can play knight d3, or more common, bishop e3, and then f3, so my bishop can scoot back. I defend my center, my knight's going to come to d3, and I'm going to play on the queen side, and my king side is safe. And what black often does is pushes all his pawns on the king side, and it's very exciting. Now, one of the good and bad things about the King's Indian in general is whenever you get a position where black is attacking and white's winning on the queen side, because white has all this extra space, the engine always says white's doing great. Always. Every engine. It says, yay, white, I'll take white. Because it doesn't see a checkmate, so it just loves white's position. White has more space. White's going to push here. If black wants to do anything on the king's side, often it involves a sacrifice. And the engine's like, sacrifice no good. As Grandmaster games go on, and they get to move 20, 25, 30, often the engine says, oh, black is doing okay. So if you need to win and you have the black pieces, this is a very good opening because sometimes you just checkmate your opponent out of nowhere. Nakamura has a lot of famous games. Garry Kasparov has a lot of famous games where they win with black and it looks like black just runs over white. Okay. Now, when I was black against Yuri Shulman, we have a lot of King's Indians. It didn't look like I had any attack. And then he just won on the queen side. I was embarrassed. I also lost to Dmitry Gurevich that way once. But I did beat him once, the King's Indian too. Not very many draws. Both sides play for what they got. And then it either works or it doesn't. Either black mates white, or sometimes white makes a queen on the queen side. Still loses because he gets mated. And what's common here is black plays knight f6, knight g6 to get his knights in action. When white is busting through here on the queen side, often black plays rook f7 to defend, bishop f8 to defend, then his rook can come over here. So he's defending and attacking. So I'll just make up some moves because I like making up moves. So these are all just made up, but it's fun. Okay, there we go. Some positions like this have occurred, and black plays h5, rook g7, g4, and tries to give mate, and black tries to defend himself at the same time. And you can look at many games in these kinds of positions, and from a practical point of view, especially for club players, it's probably better to have black. You just keep attacking, and your opponent has to show defensive skill, which is not something a lot of people have. Even strong grandmasters, they like to attack also. So you get these kinds of positions. Question? What?
Sorry, I just had one quick question. When black does that initial f5 push to start attacking the king side, is it an option for e4, the pawn on e4 to take f5?
Yes. You can always take on f5. The question was, can you take on f5? You can't always take on f5. And often with the knights, not like if the knight's on e8, black has many ways to recapture. They're all possible. If black takes with a pawn, generally you want to play f4 and block. Black could take with the knight, and then his knight's pretty good. And obviously white gets the e4 square. It's possible to take on f5, but the reason white played knight e1, not only to play knight d3 and play on the queen side, but he generally wants to bolster his center with f3 and keep the position closed so black doesn't checkmate him. But you can take on f5. It's just not very popular. And the other way of playing for white is to play knight to d2. The ideas are the same, except instead of playing knight to d3 later, white wants to play more energetically with knight c4. If I could get rid of this stuff. I can't get rid of it? Oh, okay. So for example, I'll play knight e8. Got to play something. Yeah. And white wants to play knight to c4, which is more aggressive than knight d3. We're putting pressure here, and our knight can attack more squares in that camp. And that's the idea behind knight d2. What's funny is after knight d2, c5 is very common. But it's not common after knight e1. And after knight e1, if you play c5, I want to play b4 and open the position up, and I can play knight d3 and try to play b4 immediately. Whereas after knight d2, that's not so easy. I can't cheat. ChessBase won't let me cheat. Now the thing is, it's very easy to get confused. And I'll give you some anecdotal evidence. That's the best kind of evidence, other than conjecture. So there's a player in Michigan rated between 1,200 and 1,400, depending on what day it is. Usually Thursdays, he's 1,400. Tuesdays, he works at the post office. Wednesdays, okay. So, and he has every book on the King's Indian. He just studies the King's Indian. He does nothing else. And he plays black. He doesn't play white. He plays black. And whenever he gets this position, that's it. Nothing. Tabula rasa. Right, Casimir? Whenever he gets his pieces on these squares, which is what you would think a King's Indian is, now he's just like, I don't know, doesn't remember anything he looked at. So he plays like here. He just makes legal moves that don't have anything to do with the position. So I've had problems in other openings, not this one because I play it so much, where I'll get a position that I've studied forever and I'm out. Like, I remember nothing. And one of them is in a Chigorin line where I sack a piece. So I only do it in 1 minute and 3 minute chess because I can't remember anything. And that doesn't really matter in 1 minute or 3 minute. Once I get the position, it's like move 15. I've studied that position for hours. I can't remember anything because it was 10 years ago. So some of the King's Indian variations take a lot of memory and understanding. So what a lot of people do who are club players is they have a pet line. They play one line and maybe it's not very common. And then they know it and their opponent's like, what? That's not what people usually play. And you can do that with a lot of different stuff. Bishop g4 is an interesting pet line. I faced that today. And I think I won, but maybe I imagined it. I've played that too, but you could play knight bd7, you could play c5, you could play e5. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. And the other problem is, even if you play the main line, the one I just showed you d5, but bishop e3 is also a very common move. And then you have to decide if you're going to play knight g4 and go into these lines, and if you know them well. It's not easy. Now, one trick that I play sometimes, and it has worked because tricks are for kids, okay, is in this position, e5, instead of castling, I'll play this move. And people who memorize things and don't understand the position, a lot of them make a big mistake here. In this position, black should either play knight g or knight g5 if he's had too much to drink, knight g4 or take on d4. If in this position after castles, black is the kind of person who always plays knight c6, which is the main move, then often bishop e3 will catch them unawares and they'll play knight c6 anyway, which is a mistake. Now in this position, if instead of castling, I play here, And I have the knight d2 variation, except my bishop's not on c1, it's on e3. And you can't play knight g4 because I played knight d2 first. So I'm going to get in c5 and knight c4. This is already bad for... These positions are theory with the bishop here, but I got everything. And the thing is, if you play bishop e3 in this position, then knight g4 is common. But if you do it one move earlier, they might think they can transpose. So you got to be careful that you're not just trying to get to some position you know. If you don't know the position, things can be different. And if I have white, some people play this, which I don't know a lot about. And sometimes they have a lot of prep, and sometimes they don't. And the knight can go here, the knight can go here, rook here is possible, c6 and d5. And if people have those as their pet variations, and they only play those, and I'm ready for everything, I'm not going to know it as well as they do. So it's very risky to play the King's Indian with either side. If you're more booked up than your opponent, you can get big advantages and easy wins with either side if you're doing a lot of studying. One of the worst things you can do is know what the King's Indian is and then say okay, let's go. I know this is the King's Indian. Okay, done. And then your opponent knows to move 15 in the variations he plays, and you get in trouble. And I have a lot of games with white, and sometimes I don't want to play 20 moves of theory in the King's Indian because maybe I was sleeping for the last 5 years and I don't know the theory anymore. So one of the lines that I like to play is bishop f4. Conversely, a lot of GMs like Varakobian like to play bishop g5, which I've also played, just trying to get the opponent out of theory. And the idea is, whether you play bishop f4 or bishop g5, you're not going to play e4, you're going to play e3, and that takes black a lot more time to attack you. And with your bishop here and here, it's hard to move these things out of the way. They're sort of in trouble. And Var, for example, in these positions where people are trying to win his two bishops, he likes the castle queenside. So if it's something like this, Var's going to play queen here, castle queenside, and take advantage of the open H file. And again, this is a pet line of Var's. So if he's played 50 games and you've never seen it, it's not good for you. And this happens a lot in the King's Indian. One side plays the line that they like to play, and they play it often. The other side's like, what? That's what databases are for. Memorize every game everybody's played. At the Grandmaster level, if you're playing in a round-robin slow tournament, if those ever exist anymore, you can prepare for your opponent for hours or days or weeks. And if they play the King's Indian, you look at every King's Indian they ever played, you have a good idea what they're going to do. But if you're a club player, you're playing another club player, you don't know what they do, they don't know what you do. So usually having a pet line is good. When I play bishop f4, sometimes they transpose to a Grunfeld. But I used to play bishop f4 against the Grunfeld, so I'm not super sad. I'm a little sad, but not super sad. Usually when the bishop goes here or here early, instead of black playing for mate like he usually does, it's better to play for c5 because the queen side is not defended as much. So here I would recommend black playing c5 and then taking advantage of, my queen can go here or here, my knight can attack this. And this bishop doesn't make a lot of sense in these kind of Benoni positions. Like, why is the bishop there? So, and white hasn't played e4. If he does, it takes him an extra tempo. And black can play on the queen side here because he has this open diagonal. So I like c5 for black in positions where white's moved his bishop early and undefended his queen side. It's more difficult to play this. Now, there's a trap in the bishop f4 line, which some people fall into, which is they want to play for e5, and they start counting, not their strong suit, and they're like, oh, I can't play e5 here, I don't have enough defense. So they play this mistake, and then when they play here, they still don't have as much defense, because this rook is overworked. Takes, confusing the audience. because the rook on e8 is defending the queen and the knight. So after you take, I trade queens, and white's up a pawn. And if black really, really, really wants to play e5 in this position, you can play e6, queen e7, e5, or you could play queen e8, e5, and then you'll probably play queen e7 later, probably. I had a game, I think it was the first game of chess ever played. It was in something like 1986, probably about right. I was playing Alex Fishbein in the US Junior Championship, and he played a very interesting way. Queen a5. He wanted to play e5, so his queen defends it. And I played something like here, and then b4. He defended, I went back. And the problem with this position is, I'm going to play c5, which is annoying. I already have my queenside initiative started, and I'm not worried about a kingside attack because my pawn's not here, which it usually is. So there's no knight f4. There's no f here, threatening stuff. This is already better for white. I ended up winning that game. I think that's the only game I ever beat Fishbein. The other games, I forgot what the result was. I don't remember. It literally, I don't care what the results were. They weren't good. Yeah. Okay. There's other lines that are also tricky where white doesn't play knight f3, but plays bishop e2 and bishop g5. And in fact, when I worked with Gregory Kaidanov, the lion from Lexington, born and bred in Lexington, he said, you don't play bishop g5. He plays bishop g5. He says, so you should play bishop e2 and then play knight f3, because a lot of your opponents will think you might go there. Scare them. Then just play knight f3, because that's what I play. Now, after bishop g5, the main point is e5 is bad, and if somebody plays that, they should feel bad. Okay, now they're actually losing. Truth hurts. Because I didn't play knight f3, I played bishop g5. So now the truth hurts. This is hanging, this is hanging. It's pinned, so good luck. All right, but you don't play e5, obviously. And a lot of these positions, black does play c5, like in the positions I was showing you, where the bishop goes here, because once again, bishop g5 is making e5 less palatable, but it makes c5 even better because the queen can come out and we get pressure on the diagonal and we're not playing for mate anymore. And probably the scariest variation is the 4 pawns attack. It's actually scary for both sides. Okay, in this position, black has many moves he can choose from. And, if you play the 4 pawns attack, usually you're playing pretty aggressively with white and you're trying to run over your opponent. And if you play the King's Indian with black, you can't say like, I'll just play King's Indian and see what happens. If you don't know any theory and some of these different variations, you can get in a lot of trouble. And unlike the London, where people close their eyes and make the same 8 moves with white, you can't do that in the King's Indian. And a lot of beginning King's Indian players do that. Players under 1400, they don't care what white does. They castle, they play knight here, they play e5. They don't care what white does. They just make all the same moves. And sometimes those moves are okay, and sometimes they're not. So you have to pay attention to what your opponent's doing, obviously, frankly. And the other problem with playing the King's Indian with black, and this is a problem with every opening that people on the internet, when I'm streaming, don't understand, is you can't play the opening you want. It takes 2 to tango. If your opponent plays here, you're probably not going to play a King's Indian. If your opponent plays here, I can't play there, probably not going to play the King's Indian. King's Indian almost always starts in this fashion. And occasionally, I'll face somebody who plays g6 first because they want to be more flexible. They're thinking about playing a Dutch. They're thinking about playing a Pierce or a Modern. And a lot of times, we just transpose to a King's Indian, but they're making me think the first 5 moves. I'm like, wait a minute, should I play e4? Is this guy going to play a Dutch? And when I do play e4, then I usually play c4. And often, I'll just get this position. But black can also play knight c6 if he wants to not play a King's Indian and play something weird. A favorite of Yasser Seirawan before everybody was born, including Yasser. That's how old his stories are. Before I was born, I played knight c6. Yeah. But okay, the typical move order is this stops e4. Now, if you don't play the move order with black, if you play g6 or d6 and you're planning on transposing, your opponent might not let you. They could play e4 and not play c4. c4 is a key exponent. That's a key move in the King's Indian. If your opponent never plays c4, it's not a King's Indian. It's either a Pertz or a modern. Because I can play c3, I can play knight c3. It's different than a King's Indian. So normally, if you want to play King's Indian with black, you play knight f6 and then g6. I also like to mention, one of the things I do against the King's Indian is not play c4 and just play bishop here, bishop here. I might play c4 later. I might. So I'll play bishop g5 and then knight bd2. And they're trying to play King's Indian, but I'm trying to play something boring. And in fact, the reason I do this with white is I do it with black. Okay, and what I mean is, there are some people that play knight here, pawn here, bishop here, castle. They don't care what you do. And when I have black against people who play this way, usually this is how I play with black. So if I'm playing like this with black every game, why not have white and have an extra tempo? Because it's the same thing, it's just colors reversed, but I'm black instead of white, so I could have white in this position by playing knight f3, bishop g5. And sometimes I do that. And there's a game that Kovalik won before you were born. I'm not kidding either. And by the way, Kovalik died about 4 months ago. I don't know. He was US champion before you were born. And he has the very famous game. What's Kovalik's most famous game? That's right. Yeah. He said, yeah, the Kavavalanche. Gufeld Kovalik, student Olympiad, 1962, I think, but I'm not sure. I think 62. The point of the story wasn't to tell you about that game or Kovalik. The point of the story was he didn't play for the US. He played for Czechoslovakia when it still existed. Then he went to the US later. So he was one of the best players there. Then he was one of the best players here. And he played c3, which is a weird move. And his idea was he wants to play bishop g5. And when you put your pawns like this, bishop g7 isn't really hurting you. You got this like wall against the bishop on g7. So Kovalik liked to go his own way, as you saw from the Kavavalanche game, where he plays like a lunatic and wins. So you have to know some of the sidelines. And people who play the London, and there's a lot of people who play the London, if you play the King's Indian against them, they're taking away your King's Indian. Because, you know, it could be a London. So, yeah. What I mean is, like, if you play bishop f4, this is like my game with Kamsky, I think. I mean, is this a King's Indian or a London? The answer is fries. Yeah. Now, that's if it's a King's Indian. If it's a London, then what's the answer? Come on, somebody get it. There's a lot of you. Ugh. No? The answer is chips. Okay, you get it. You'll get it in about 10 years. Yeah.
Is it F5?
Is it F5? F5. What? I can't play F5 when I talk about the London because that's the Dutch. So can't go Dutch. Although C5 is good. Okay, so what you learn from this lecture is the King's Indian has dozens of different variations, and this is why the best prepared players in the world, okay, who were the world champions and top players, they played the King's Indian because all they did was study chess. So Fischer, Kasparov, it's very combative, and there's a lot of different variations. So either you know all the variations, which is impossible, or you know what you know, and if that happens, then you're going to know more than your opponent. And a lot of the top players in the world, they just study every variation from one color. They don't necessarily play it with both sides. And they're always playing it with a win for black. And nowadays, unfortunately, a lot of tournaments for the top players are knockouts. And they're on the internet, and they're blitz and bullet. So if it's a 2-game knockout, recommended by Ben Simon, if they lose the first game with white, they want to play black in the King's Indian next game because they can't draw. They need to win to tie the match. So they want to play something really sharp and complicated. So if you like sharp and complicated, King's Indian is good for either side. You can have a lot of fun with that. It's not symmetrical. It's not boring. And there's many, many, many books on the King's Indian. You can buy dozens of books, and some of the books are just on one variation because there's so much you can do. And a lot of the theory from the 50s and 60s, they don't like that anymore, so they play other stuff. And let me give you one example before we end, is one of the main variations, like in the 50s and 60s, is almost never played anymore. And that's where, white plays bishop g5, and then the bishop usually goes to h4 after it gets attacked, and he plays this. And there were a lot of games in the 50s and 60s with this line, and it just died out. But that means you could play it with either side, and they're like, what? I don't know this. You have to go to a time machine to figure it out. A lot of the King's Indian lines are fashionable, and then they're not. And then when they're not fashionable, you can play them, and people are like, what's this? This isn't what Kasparov did yesterday and Carlsen did, in the future. What is this? Yeah.
I know a lot of people that play that, but none of them are pro players, though.
Yeah. He said he knows a lot of people who play it, but none of them are pro players. Yeah. And what a chess teacher that I know in Michigan, where I was brought up, he told his students, if you play the King's Indian when you're black, says you're always going to lose to a better player. If you want to be better players, that's not the right opening for you. I'm not sure he's right. He just meant that they'll understand it, you won't. Well, the way to understand it is to play it a lot and lose and learn your lessons. But he was worried they would not know how to play the King's Indian, and then they would just be confused because it's very sharp and tactical, and you have to have a lot of experience. Well, you get experience because sometimes you lose, and then you play the opening a lot and you get better. So losing's okay, but you have to learn from your losses. And when I'm white against the King's Indian, if I'm playing somebody good, I try not to play the same variation all the time so they can book up for me. I've played basically everything, and I haven't really found anything that I like the best. I like white's position, but I don't know what's the best for white. And grandmasters today play all kinds of different stuff. And the games are very exciting, especially when black checkmates white. Or if I have black and I checkmate white. When I'm white and get checkmated, that's not exciting. Boo, boo. So if you like attacking the king and you like double-edged positions, play the King's Indian for black. And if you're worried about the King's Indian with the white pieces, you should have a special line that you play. It's the only line that you play, and you'll know it better than your opponent, so you'll be less scared, maybe. Or start playing e4, I don't know. All right, this is Grandmaster Ben Finegold with the King's Indian lecture once again. I want to thank Olivier Bousquet, famous poker player, very good chess player, for sponsoring this lecture and last week's lecture on the Tarrasch French defense. If you want to sponsor a lecture, contact Karen, ask us in Twitch, ask us in Twitter, ask us in Discord, write a note in the sky. We'll see it. Just make sure it's legible. And you too can sponsor a lecture in the future. Thanks for watching. Thanks to my live audience. Thanks to the people on YouTube who are watching later. And most of all, thanks to Karen. Yay, Karen. All right, see you guys next time. Like and subscribe. Bye.